I'd also like to introduce you at this stage to Matt Griffiths, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Youth Music. Come and sit down.
Thank you.
I'm going to look at David now to see how long we might have for Q&As.
20 minutes?
I think we're doing quite well on time. Toby's actually keeping around.
Okay, we've got a decent amount of time for some questions. We may well have some questions that have come in from the people who've joined us virtually, who are seeing us through that camera up there. If we have one. Thank you very much. Okay. I mean, for me, just sitting through that, I picked up on Pete's idea of this unofficial space, which the old benefits system inadvertently gave to musicians to focus, as the bass guitarist said, every single day on perfecting and songwriting. I was just minded of how important this question is of the community around Jen when she was putting on gigs, editing a blog, packing cassettes, whatever it is. There's a group of people around who have a like mind and share those enthusiasms. And then I think Chris's scholarly and poetic insight into what's happening right now was a very, very strong piece. So we have, I think, some roving microphones. Yes, we do. And if you'd like to raise your hand to put a question to the panel, do so now, and I'll get through as many as I possibly can. And we're going to start with the gentleman here with the beard who reminded me of just how harrowing it was putting on, or attempting to put on Love Parade in Newcastle.
I think my experience was comparatively painless towards Andy. It was really interesting. I thought all three of the speakers were absolutely fantastic this morning. I've come down from Newcastle for this. It was worth the trip just to hear you speak. I'd just like to say that first. But I just wanted to ask a question. My name's Jim Maudsley. I'm the Chief Executive of an organisation called Generator. We're a music development agency. And we specialise in shaping artists and making them aware of the commercial aspects of where they might go. And we also develop music businesses. So I was just wondering, with the panel, we're talking broadly about music education, how important they think there's a role for teaching young people, particularly the ones who want a career in, say, popular music or career or developing their craft to have a view to a career in the music industry. How important it is that music education plays a role in teaching young people about how the music industry actually works.
Okay, so this is a question about the music industry and the career. Chris, why don't you take that one to start with, and we'll see where we go.
Yeah, I think it's really changed actually over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. When I left university in the mid-90s, there was just a few of these kind of music industry degrees just starting to spring up. I think there was quite a good one in Liverpool. There was one at Bucks New University. And they were very much in their infancy, and they weren't great at the time, and they didn't have a particularly good reputation, partly because they were still very new, and partly because a lot of people who work in the music industry think that what they do is basically magic, and you can't learn it at university. But that's really changed, and there's, as well as music industry courses, really great music business courses, there's some amazing popular music academies like ACM in Guildford, BIM in Brighton, which is now expanding all over the place. And there's been some great successes coming out of those. Tom O'Dell most recently, the Kooks from BIM, obviously all of the kind of the famous Brit School alumni that we've heard of. I think there is now just about, probably way too far after the fact, a growing acceptance inside the music industry that actually there are some great skills that you can learn, like publishing and law and PR and marketing and all of those kind of things. But it's taking a while.
Yeah. Jen, what could you have learned when you were just starting out, if you were at one of those organisations? What might you have learned?
I think when I was at school, I didn't pay much attention in music class because I thought that if you wanted to be a professional musician, you had to play the violin or the trumpet or something like that. And I didn't realise that you could be a professional musician and play drums, and I definitely would have paid a lot more attention if I'd known that. So maybe for starters, being being in music class and knowing that you could end up playing with a band on a massive stage, because that's far more interesting when you're like 13, 14 than like you're going to play in an orchestra, which you get forced to do by your mum at the weekend anyway. So I think just putting a bit more worth back into instruments like the guitar and drums. But then also, if you want a career outside of playing music, if you want to work in music, I'm not so sure about the going and doing a music degree, like a kind of business degree. I don't know enough about them to criticise them, but I just know that everything I've learned has been through going out there and doing it. And university is so expensive. I'm still paying off my student loan now, and I just feel like if you could get a job low down and work your way up, you'd probably end up learning more and you'd meet more people. And I feel like that could be a good direction to take also.
Matt, sorry, Chris.
Just to add to that, all of those people I mentioned in my talk, Jessica Kinkett, Jamie Milton, Sam Kilcoyne, all of that, to sort of return to that point about Michael Gove, none of those people are sitting around waiting for somebody to give them permission. They're not perfecting the tools of their trade before they go out. They're just going out there, just learning on the job, making mistakes, learning from them, and they're kind of transforming the music ecosystem as they do.
A lot of my favourite bands of all time, really. Some of their earliest records were quite musically inept, really, and that was part of what I loved about them. There was just a kind of very enthusiastically communicated idea. I mean, Roadrunner by Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers is one of the greatest records of all time, and it's just 2 chords, really. But there's just this indefinable magic that musicians of a certain age and gusto they bring to the way they deploy their creativity, and also, what happens over time is that kind of raw inspiration, that urge to communicate, that desire to just be looked at by lots of people, is kind of mutates into skill over a long time. You can't really, if Jonathan Richman tried to rewrite, to do Roadrunner again, tried to write a Roadrunner-like song at the age of 50, it would be quite embarrassing. But certain things only kind of work at a certain point in time. And I think when I love that kind of that window that bands have, the musicians have early on in their lives, where they have an idea and that they can't express it as well as they'd like to, but somehow something kind of magical happens. So the first time I interviewed a group called The Horrors, they just put out 2 singles, and you kind of loved what they were trying to do more than what they actually sort of did. But you interviewed them and they talked the best record in the world, and you just knew that one day they would make that record. Radiohead were a bit like that as well. First time I interviewed Radiohead, same thing. They were imagining this record that they hadn't quite sort of made yet. And and part of that feeds into the, other influences are important. The art school thing that so many musicians have Blur and the Kinks and so forth. And so that grounding, just lots of ideas, having loads of ideas, I think is more important than maybe doing a music degree almost all of the time, I would say.
Matt, do you want to wrap up and then we'll find another question?
Yeah, I guess sort of looking at Jim's question, primarily the benefits personally, musically, socially of making music in young people's lives as they find their place in the world. That's absolutely, 100% why it's there. And then secondly, of course, a lot of young musicians and young performers will want to progress. And I think that's back to a kind of challenge for music education in terms of having that real generosity of spirit and also confidence and courage to take into account the music that's making young people tick more and being able to respond to that really positively without doing the thing about saying, no, we'll tell you what you should be saying. And that's a bit of a generalization, but in order for young musicians to progress if they want to, there needs to be several ways that they can, and I think that's going to be a lot down to a broad understanding that music is music, and let's get rid of this idea that there's some kind of hierarchy about what's good or bad, because for young people, that's not how they found their place in the world.
Thank you, Matt. Okay. Yes, just down here. And would you get away from the mic and could you say who you are and where you're from when you do it? Thank you.
So Helen, I'm from the Institute of Education and I'm a music psychologist. So one of the things I like to say is, first of all, clearly music is a language, you're absolutely right, but it's actually lots of sub-languages as well. And we mustn't forget that. You've been quite critical of music education as it stands in schools, and lots of us who are engaged with it would agree with that. But there's a big danger at the moment that it will disappear altogether from schools. And my question is, what impact would that have, not only on the classical and jazz and so on, but also your field, if there was no music education in our schools? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. What impact would there be if music disappeared on your sector, if music disappeared completely from schools? Chris?
Really, really difficult question to answer. And by the way, I mean, I take your point that I guess collectively we've been a bit critical, but first of all, my point about music technology being more and more important these days is very much that it should fit alongside traditional music education. I didn't study music at school, although I was always musical. In fact, I started a band at the age of 15, never having been into the music room. And of course, the first place we went when we started this band, because none of us had instruments, was to go and raid the music room. So kind of a fail on our part, really, that we weren't already welcome there. Although interestingly, when I think back to my kind of education, I think about the two teachers who were most inspiring in a music sense were my physics teacher, Robin Pike, who used to promote gigs at a small pub nearby in a market town called Wendover. He used to have some amazing bands come and play there. Some of us used to get involved in helping promote those bands. A friend of mine, Ted Cockle, was very involved with that. He now runs Virgin EMI. Another teacher I remember from school, Jackie Brooker, was my German teacher, happened to mention one day at the beginning of Double German that she'd been to see Jimi Hendrix. Of course, we all leapt on that, and sort of 2 hours later we realised we'd been speaking fluent German about music. So I guess just really to return to my point that music can be, if you like, a platform for exploring other ideas, and it's something that everybody can tune into and everybody can get excited about. I'm very aware that I haven't really answered your question, which is I dread to think what school would be like if there wasn't at least a music room for people like me to go and raid, even if I wasn't inspired to play the flute or the violin or whatever it might be. Actually, one thing I would like to say is that in putting together this stuff about music technology, I sort of did a little bit of fact-checking about myself, about my facts. My mother used to teach in a school in Buckinghamshire, and I was interested to know whether you could study music technology at A-level, because I was very aware that in higher education that's a really big deal. I gather it is now possible to study music technology A-level, which is brilliant. So that I think that's great, and just to reiterate my point, that I think that we are now entering a phase where maybe students, maybe teachers have as much to learn from their students as their students do from them.
What I'm taking from Chris's answer, and from other things I've heard this morning, that the field of popular music, broadly speaking, happens in perhaps a accidental way, in the gaps that are created by some rooms or the dole in Pete's case, or indeed the physics teacher that happened to, or it wasn't the physics teacher who'd seen Hendrix, but there's something unofficial about this, which is quite interesting. Matt, what would happen if music disappeared from schools altogether?
It wouldn't be good news. It would be, in a way, if we're about access to music for young people, and particularly in youth music's case for those with least opportunity, the school day is where most children and young people still go. So if we're going to get access to opportunity in music, one of the things it should be still in is in school. It's still going to be a GCSE, it's still going to be an A-level, and it's still being in the curriculum. I think what we're trying to say is, without it sounding critical, there's a committed, passionate workforce in music education in and out of school. I think it's just about having the courage to acknowledge even more what's making young people tick in terms of their experience of music, which we've heard about today. Because that, for me, explains and demonstrates a really strong market, if you like, for music that sometimes the grown-ups have no involvement with whatsoever. If you can harness that and bring some of that with courage and confidence into the school day, then I think we could move mountains.
It seems to me that, excuse me, sorry. It seems to me that there are different aesthetic sort of conventions that apply to different kinds of music. And if someone wants to excel in a classical field, then it seems to me that there are no shortcuts. That kind of application is, the kind of moving towards a vocation is absolutely essential. Whereas rock and roll, all music made in a pop music made in a post-rock and roll era, beat, punk, dance, disco, it's the passage that people seem to kind of go through initially when establishing themselves, it seems to be like more akin to a kind of outsider art that became more popular than anyone ever expected it to be. And the conditions for excellence in the early stages of that kind of music making are not always predicated on sort of musical virtuosity. So I guess, depending on what the what sort of predilections young people looking to make music have, then you sort of different kinds of music education would apply to them. That seems to me that would be my guess at any rate.
I actually took music technology at A-level and dropped it because it was really boring, and because we had to sit and read about music theory, and all I wanted to do was play guitar. So I had a band outside of school which practiced in my garage and did Marilyn Manson and Nirvana covers, and that was what I was into. And I feel like that's quite the same for a lot of young people, where music's going to happen anyway in EDM, in rock. You're just going to go about and do that yourself. I used to go on the internet and download guitar tabs and learn to play and teach myself. And same like when I started to want to play drums, I just went to a practice space and would just sit with earphones in and play along as best I could. And you kind of teach yourself by watching things online. I feel like music is such an important part to young people that they're still going to make it and still want to be involved with it. But most people do it outside of school because it's kind of cooler, isn't it? And school is kind of like the boring thing you do where you get learnt, this is like A, B, C, this is how to read music. But this is for the kind of music that I listen to and I'm involved with. When it comes to classical music or jazz, I don't know whether you need to know theory for jazz. I'm not entirely sure, but I feel like that could suffer if you weren't playing in school orchestras. I played trumpet in school orchestra, and that's how I learnt to read music. And I suppose if I'd wanted to progress in that field, then not having music at school would have been really damaging.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. I've got a couple of questions that have come online, and then we'll come back to the room. I think there are a couple perhaps for you, Jen. The statistic that you revealed about the PRS statistic, of which only 13% of the registered composers in the UK were female. How can girls be encouraged and supported in music? And that's from Music for You. And how can we help young bands who are not in London?
Okay.
So a
first
couple of
one, girls in music. Well, it's quite a male rhetoric as well in music journalism. When you go to gigs, it's like a boy thing to do. And like, there's so many times when I'll be on the radio and like I tell him off now, my co-host, to be like, this is a female producer. I'm like, shut, you wouldn't say this is a male producer. You read an article or review about band and it's like 3 girls from LA, and you're like, you wouldn't say 3 boys from LA, you just say a band from LA. You know, I feel like the whole language around it is something that people need to realise and address and change. And it's, you know, it's not being like, oh, look, she's playing drums, she's a really good drummer for a girl. You know, it's the whole way we think about things. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed as a whole. And more girls should be encouraged to play music. I don't really know how. I think it's something that maybe we need to do ourselves. There needs to be another riot girl movement, you know? It needs to be stopped.
Where do you think we are on the scale if 0 is absolutely hopelessly backward and 10 is enlightened to a high degree? Where would you, from your experience?
Like about a 3, probably.
Right.
I mean,
Okay,
amongst
so
like
way to go.
DIY and punk, it's far better. It's more accepting. I always found like I didn't notice it so much when I was just kind of in circles in Cardiff playing in bands, and everyone would get on and play with each other, and no one would really like bother you or anything. But then the further up you go, like I'll go to DJ and a guy will come up and start playing with my levels. I'll be like, what are you doing? I know what I'm doing. I know how to do this. And it happens to a lot of my friends. They'll be setting up and a guy will come over and be like, are you all right with that? Do you need some help? So I think it's still pretty much like we don't really know what we're doing, but girls really do. And I think just more girls need to be involved and do it for yourself, essentially. And then for new bands starting out, I don't think it's essential to be living in London whatsoever. The internet is such a brilliant thing. You can build up a scene and you can get good back home, and you can build up a desire for people to want you to come somewhere now if you build your fan base right. And social media is so great for that. Things like YouTube, things like Twitter, things like Facebook are so great for a band to be able to develop. The band that I'm working with, Cut Ribbons, they live in Llanelli because it's so cheap for them to live. 2 of them are actually on the dole, trying to sort of like develop it to a point where they're going to be good enough to then move further afield.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Trampoline are living in Hornsey on Couscous, but they're living next door, presumably, to the Kinks' old studio. They're living kind of where the Eurythmics recorded in that church.
Yeah,
There's a
well,
creative scene, isn't there? And London, despite all that Jen says about the geographical effects of the web, actually, London remain. What's your view of London as a
Well, I
centre
think
of
you're
influence?
sort of, to a degree, you're relying on luck, and you can work really hard to minimise that reliance on luck, obviously. I did find that, you know, when I noticed that when there are certain things that fell Trampoline's way, just as a direct result of living where they were living. As you say, they were around the corner from Conch Studios, and although they can't afford to record at Conch Studios, they did befriend an engineer. I think it was someone, I'm not sure if it was an engineer, who would go around and tell them when a well-known band hadn't turned up for the session that they'd booked, and they'd quickly get their equipment, and that single was recorded at Conch. But I think Ray Davies might not who owns Conch Studios, might not necessarily know that that was recorded there.
Right, I'm going to ask Matt to say something from the youth music perspective, because one of the absolute key aims is around funding across England in a very particular way. We've got about 5-7 minutes left, so I'm going to just pick some questions. I saw there were some raised hands. We're just going to try and get through a couple more questions, and then I'm going to ask Matt to wrap up. Yes, okay, so let's go on London versus the rest of the UK.
Yeah, well, I think for those of us involved in detail in music education, one of the things about the review in 2011 talked about the patchy provision, and I think what we've identified is very much about how you disperse investment very carefully geographically. So we really look at areas of need, areas of deprivation, educational attainment, to inform the decisions we make about where we put an investment. And there's 331 investments that we do now in England. A lot of those organisations will have spaces for young bands to develop and to develop their craft working alongside a mentor. So all those organisations are on our website in terms of where we reach. I think the thing about it, it's again going back to, I think it's Pete's point, if you can find that person, that music leader who knows their craft, but is also that mentor who gives that bit of self-belief, gives you a bit of a go, and is very willing with a generosity of spirit to share the work of Trampoline, for example, and introducing young bands to other people, that's where it can start to build up a momentum, rather than keep them to yourselves or not share it. So I think there's something around the kind of leadership of people who are in positions of providing music education as much as there are spaces.
Okay, I'm going to try and do this rapidly. We're looking for sharp answers. There's a hand that's been up just here from this gentleman just down here.
Thank you. It's Dick Hallam. I've just taken over as chair of the Music Education Council. And I want to say thank you very much. I found the presentations really interesting. And I was thinking about the last 10 years with richly the Music Manifesto starting in 2003. We've now got the National Plan for Music Education. And I'm wondering whether you feel that where we are with what we're trying to do through the National Plan will address the challenges that you've raised.
Do you want to respond to that, Matt?
Should we be honest? I think in principle, the principles and ideas of the plan and the principles and ideas of hubs, absolutely. That's a really good way of working, but the devil's going to be absolutely in the detail in terms of the progress that we're making. In terms of today and fresh thinking for music education, if there can be that kind of acceptance that music learning takes place in all sorts of environments, both in and out of school, and they're both as legitimate as each other, that'll help us make progress. And I think, secondly, for those of us, a lot of us in positions of leadership, to actually have that really thorough understanding of young people's innate passion for music anyway, without our intervention. And with our intervention, where we really target what we do, as I said before, we could really develop things and support those who really, without our intervention, wouldn't get the chance.
I think we have time for 2 questions. I want to take a question from David here at the front, and I think from the Kumba string section just down here on my left. So should we start down here?
Yeah, this is yeah, this is for
Yeah, you probably do.
Oh, really? All right. Hello. Yeah.
That's better.
Just about the schooling thing, I think when it was, is it more the what's on the curriculum for the actual subject in terms of interest in music and people taking up the subject, or is it more about sort of like the actual school system and the environment? Because like personally, I think music it's a lot about what you're surrounded by. Yeah, because it's like you said something about learning an instrument at school, right? And you were like, yeah, if I knew I could play drums, I would have done it. But in my sense, it was a bit different. I was sort of like, it didn't really matter what I played. I just sort of wanted to play something. And that's because a lot of what I was seeing around me, luckily I went to a school with a good music department. So it was like I was seeing a lot of different people play different instruments at a high level. So it wasn't sort of about like, drums is cool, or this is cool, or that's cool. It was more about like, I see someone playing that, it's like, I can play that. I mean, I play bass, but I know that's quite a cool instrument, but part of me thinks if I could have played violin to a high level or flute or anything like that, I would have done it. So do you think it's more sort of about the actual system where some schools don't have good music departments?
And the importance is what you're saying is being around other people playing other instruments and an elite of people who can really perform. Yeah,
because like
what would you say, Jen?
Look up to your peers, don't you? So whatever you're surrounded by is the kind of thing that you want to be more like, you want to assimilate to a lot of the time. And I feel like that's probably a challenge for music education, whereas, you know, it's such a broad spectrum of music and so many different people want to be involved with it in so many different ways. How can you find a syllabus that caters to everyone's desires? I think that's the problem.
Thank you, Jen. So we're going to have to end now because we've got a minute, and perhaps that's appropriate that David, who's one of our really valued ambassadors at Youth Music, has got the final question.
Thank you. I just want to say how valuable I found the presentation, how interesting. And I think you touched on many points, and the questions have also touched on many points. One of the things that I'd like to say is that I think that the importance of music in education isn't just for those who are going to go on to become professional musicians or even who aspire to. Yeah. The importance is the difference that it makes to people to be able to find a way to express themselves. You know, as Victor Wooten said, expressing yourself isn't just about beginning to express yourself skillfully, it's about beginning to express yourself. And if that place isn't found in school, people often find places outside of school, but I think there are lots of people who don't ever find a conduit for expression of the passion they feel for music because they never have an opportunity to. So I think although we all have questions about the curriculum, the important thing is that people are able to get their hands on instruments and are encouraged to play, however badly. The other thing point I want to make is that I found my way into the music business by being able to get a job in a record company, discovering how the business worked. I was in bands, didn't understand the business at all. You know, you made a point earlier, Pete, about how the social demarcation, are poor people now able to get into music, blah, 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 blah. But one of the things that I have discovered from speaking to people in record companies all the time now is that internships are more and more something that people will say, I will give you a job, you can work for the summer, I can't pay you. Unless you have parents who can afford to fund you, it's often now that the music business itself is a closed shop. So I think that the work of youth music in actually enabling people to be able to have access to music, to have access to opportunity to find out how the business works, to have access to people who can speak to them about the business who are in there is more and more valuable because it's becoming increasingly difficult, firstly, to access it, secondly, to make a living from it. I work with bands who have had #1 records who are barely making a living. And they're not making a living from record sales, they're making a living from merchandise and from gigs. And, you know, because, as you pointed out, also, people are accessing music without paying for it. About 20% of music is paid for. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for this generation, even when they become excellent, to make a living from it. And that's something that we ought to recognize as well and encourage people to find ways to make a living, even when they're actually doing well. To encourage them to plow on, to find ways to get their music out there because it's becoming much, much harder. And I think we need to acknowledge that.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to you now.